Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information.
Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. Super excited for you to be joining us today. We're on a mission to become Australia's most trusted property podcast, and also super excited to be doing this with Amy. It's been a while. I've done lots of episodes with Pete recently, and so good to be doing an episode with Amy. How are you doing and how's life?
Yeah, no, it's really great, Chris. I recorded with Pete again this morning, and I was just saying it's recording this pre-Christmas at the moment, but by the time you're listening to it, it's January. But it's the property market. It's sometimes like things are transacting all the way up until Christmas Eve, and then everyone just shuts down, and no one wants to think about property or talk about property for a good month, I would say. And then it just booms back into action again.
Do you find it's a lot of the conveyancers and the lawyers they definitely go on holidays, and such that transacting is really hard, even if the agent wants to and there's a buyer and there's a seller, sometimes even just getting the legal sides are hard at that time?
Absolutely. So even in some contracts at the moment, there will be special conditions in the contract to say settlements cannot occur up until, say, the 8th or the 15th of January. Because you need the lawyers, you need the solicitors and conveyancers around to do all of that for you and to read contracts, etc. But yeah, it's fair to say that not much happens at the end of December, start of January.
And I think that sort of links into our episode today. So we thought it'd be pretty valuable just to talk through all the different people and all the different fingers in the pie of when you're looking to buy a property, who you need to potentially engage and think about. Like, not everyone you need to have, absolutely, but sometimes you might use them if it's a bit of a quirky situation, or you want some extra advice. So how should we attack this today, Amy? Should we just start from the top? Let's even go whether you go to a bank or a broker. Finance is usually one of the first things in the process. What do you reckon, or should we start somewhere else?
Well, first of all, I will say that we have deep dived into a lot of these specialists in other episodes. So, for example, we've done a whole episode on mortgage brokers, and we've done a whole episode of building inspections, etc. So go back to those. But the purpose of this episode is really to say, what are the key property professionals who you need to start thinking about engaging or researching or, getting referrals for at the very beginning of your property journey. We're going to have a chat about at what point in time you should get them on board, because you don't want to be all of a sudden needing to make an offer on a property and scrambling to find these professionals. And we're going to have a chat about which ones are mandatory, which ones are optional, and which ones are highly recommended, because you don't have to have all of these professionals in your team. So we'll just have a chat about in what situations you might need them and when to get them involved, and also how to find them as well. So, and I would always generally begin with thinking about the finance side of things. So the key decision there is, unless you're really lucky and you've got a heap of cash burning a hole in your pocket and you don't need a loan, you're going to need to get finance through either a bank or through a mortgage broker. So this is really something that you might start off by speaking to a bank or broker years before you're ready to buy, to get yourself ready, to have an understanding of what you need to save and what your income needs to be, et cetera, to get ready. So that is the first person that you need to have a think about. And my recommendation, and I'm sure you will agree with me, Chris, is that a mortgage broker. I would always go to a mortgage broker instead of straight to a bank. And I probably talked about why in that other episode. And, for me, it's not only having access to multiple lender options, which is a key benefit, but it's having much more tailored, personalized advice with someone who is ideally, well, in theory, a broker is much more contactable and holding your hand a lot more than the bank.
Absolutely. And it would be hard for me to argue that if, the society were going the other way and they were going to banks in droves and brokers were literally not getting market share, but 70% of loans go through brokers now. In the UK, it's 90%. I mean, when I started in the industry, it was about 40% of loans went through brokers. And so there's a reason behind that. It's the choice. Even just this week, we got an inquiry, a client who's going direct to Beyond Bank. It could have been any bank, I said there. And, they got a settlement and they've been declined the loan. And how do I get this loan settled? And, they're coming to us as brokers to look at other alternative solutions. And, we'll probably save that client in that situation because we've got lots of options. And you don't be too fearful to say, hey, I'm not going to go to a broker till I want to buy something, because sometimes you have to put things in place many years in advance. Sometimes you have to fix your credit up or get rid of credit cards or get rid of your HEX or, get your business running a bit more profitably or get a pay rise, or there's just things that you might have to do. Now, even if you don't have to do it, there's no issue starting a relationship with brokers that you might use years down the line. It was just a couple of months ago, we had 2 clients buy that I chatted to 6 years prior. So they didn't do anything. One already had a property, so I was trying to upgrade, but one was a genuine first home buyer and just took 6 years to buy. So there's no issue starting that journey earlier. And that's the benefit of going to a broker, not a bank. I mean, the chance of walking into a branch and seeing the same bank teller or the same personal banker there 6 years later, I think that's highly unlikely, particularly if they're good, because they get snapped up if they're good and move to other roles. So,
I have a story for you, Chris. Yeah. A couple of weeks ago, I had this client who did decide for whatever reason to go straight to a bank rather than a mortgage broker. And the banker was lovely. Like, I did actually manage to chat to the same banker throughout the process, but come time to settlement, the day before settlement, that client called me and said, "Oh, we didn't realize stamp duty was an additional cost." I know, I'm looking at your face right now. That was my face as well, Chris. Now, obviously, the lender, the banker, had made sure that the clients could afford the stamp duty, but at no point in time had they been sent like a breakdown of costs and a breakdown of how much they were going to be having to pay and like an allocation of costs. And they were mortified. I was mortified. And I'm not saying that all bankers are going to do that. And I'm not saying all brokers are definitely going to give you that. But I've never had that situation with a broker. And I've always found just the level of communication and support from a broker is better. And, I've called brokers out of hours before many times. I try not to. I don't want to bother you guys. But sometimes you really need an answer to things. And I don't know, some banks I find close at 4 p.m. Definitely not open on weekends. So you just want to avoid that situation if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So get yourself a good broker. There's 19,000 of them out there, but you just got to be careful who you pick.
Yes, well,
but
once
you've got one in your armory, then we can start to think about, because finance, there's no point thinking, hey, I want to buy that house in that street if you can borrow 200,000 and that house is 2 million, right? So it also gives you so you can start your journey and start looking at properties once you know what you can afford and what your budget is, and then we can start to talk about who the next people to speak to. So who would you go next, Amy?
Yeah. So, and just to finish off that point as well, Chris. So it's not mandatory to have a broker, but it's highly recommended in our opinion. So that's when that falls into that place. And also, there's no real time that you need to do it, but the sooner the better. But even if you get to that point where you're dealing with some banks and you're like, nope, I just don't want to do this, I need a broker, that's totally fine. Just reach out whenever you need one. So the next property professional, which is actually the only mandatory one, is your legal representative. And it's mandatory because you're going to need a legal rep to facilitate the transaction, to facilitate the conveyancing, which is essentially the transfer of that property from the vendor's name into your name. So that all needs to be done. But with that conveyancing process, there's kind of 2 steps to that process. The first part is getting a contract reviewed by that legal representative. And then the second part is that transfer process, and that's the mandatory part. But the contract review isn't mandatory. You can buy a property without getting the contract looked at. But for me, if you do nothing else, and if you engage no other property professional, getting a conveyancer or a solicitor to read the contract and do a review for me is so vital.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably come up with 100 different case studies here on where the conveyancer / solicitor has picked up on things. And I think a lot of people, the should be right mentality is, particularly when the market's moving really hot, And sometimes people do, they go, well, I'll sign the contract and then I'll try to negotiate in the cooling off and just not the same as negotiating up front, right?
Not at all.
What's your take on that scenario? But also, just where people have been a bit laxy-daisy and then been called out after settlement and said, if I negotiated this, should have negotiated something and I didn't, and now I've got a property with an easement through it that I didn't know, or I've got, I don't know, something else. What's some horror stories?
Yeah, so the purpose of getting that contract looked at is kind of two main things. First of all, it's to understand what you're buying. Here in Victoria, we have a lot of disclosure in the contract. In other states, there's not as much. So your legal rep might go and order these extra bits of paperwork and certificates, etc. So you want to know if there's any deal breakers in there or anything that's going to impact your decision to buy that property or the value you place on that property, first and foremost. And then in addition to that, the second part is negotiating, any conditions that you might need changed or terms or anything in the contract that you want to amend. And you're right, Chris, it's a lot harder to negotiate those changes once the contract is signed. So doing that beforehand is ideal. So when should you get a legal representative involved? And first of all, just the difference between a conveyancer and a solicitor is a solicitor is a fully qualified lawyer, and then a conveyancer just specializes in conveyancing. I'm not ever going to say one is better than the other. The two legal reps I use happen to be solicitors, but I've also seen some not so good solicitors in the past, and I've seen some incredible conveyancers. So it's not to say one or the other is better. Just find someone who you really like. But as an overall, general rule of thumb, if there's anything particularly tricky or anything that needs to get, any issues that arise later on, a solicitor is generally a little bit more capable and qualified to deal with that, in my experience.
Yeah, and I've actually had conveyancers. I completely agree with what you just said as well. We've got both. But a conveyancer that we've done a lot of work with over the years, she's absolutely amazing. Sometimes she does refer to a solicitor or a lawyer if it gets a little bit out of her scope, or she realises that it's a bit of a technical situation where you need to get some advice. So I think some of the good ones know where their lane ends, and then if they need that extra lane, they've got someone on hand. So, I guess it's just someone who's super experienced, no matter what role you're looking at, what position, and someone who's got a bit of a team around them. They've been doing it. They specialize in it. Someone who just does it a part here and a day there. I don't know. I just don't think you're seeing the amount of contracts. I
have sometimes had clients who say, my brother's, sister's, cousin's, dog's friend's a lawyer, and they're going to do the conveyancing for me, or they're going to look at the contract for me. I'm like, do they specialize in contract reviews? And sometimes then they've done it and sent it to me, and I've said, well, what about this? Or you've mean this? And I feel kind of awkward in those situations. But yeah, definitely a specialist. So when should you get the legal rep involved? Well, look, technically, you could send a contract to a legal rep a couple of days before you want to buy a property, and they do the turnaround of the review then. But for me, ideally, when you start looking at a property, you already have someone in mind you want to use. You've spoken to them, you have an understanding of their fees, you have an understanding of their turnaround times. So my legal reps will do a review for me same day or on a Sunday if I really need to. But the person who you're going to be working with, well, maybe they need 3 business days to give you something. Or maybe they have an express service where you have to pay more, and you just need to know all of those things. So when the time comes, you're not scrambling if they don't have capacity or their turnaround's too late and then you have to find someone else. So just get prepared with that.
Yeah, and please don't use the cheap $9.90 online services. Who's checking that contract? You do not know their experience. Their whole model is, and it does play into the bargain mentality a little bit. If I'm paying $1 million, I want to save on fees and lawyers and just, do you want to get a result? Do you want to get value? Do you want to get service? Or do you just want to, facilitate it and not get any real advice? We've seen some clients get some really sticky situations where it wasn't checked the contract like they thought it was. They couldn't get access to them through till settlement. It was so stressful. They spent hours and hours of their time and mistakes got made. And they could have just spent an extra $500 and got someone who's super experienced in their small little business that would have, stopped all these issues. So don't try to save a few $100s for the sake of using an online, cheap and cheerful conveyancing service.
And an extra tip there, Chris, for me is I would always want a review in writing, a contract review in writing.
Yeah,
or
cool.
There is one person I know here in Melbourne that does like a full verbal WhatsApp audio kind of thing, but she talks for like 5 minutes. But as long as you've got something that you can refer back to and there's no, miscommunication, misinterpretation, if they just talk to you over the phone, I'm not okay with that, because then you can't refer back to it, especially if something goes wrong. And it's almost reliant on you then remembering things or writing down the right notes. So I know people do that. I personally would prefer to avoid that situation.
Yeah. So I would say highly recommend it, but / mandatory. I have actually had a client who has done the process, but I think it was in ACT they purchased.
Oh, they've done the conveyancing themselves.
They did the conveyancing.
Oh, okay.
And this person is one of our biggest clients and earns millions and millions of dollars a year. We just could not fathom.
Okay, well, I'll put a little asterisk next to mandatory to say, technically, if you really wanted to do your own conveyancing, go nuts, but I'd probably not.
Yeah, and this is like the person who probably should at least do it, because their hourly rate at work's probably, what that would have taken them in. Anyway, it defied belief. Anyway. So yeah, I think maybe it's not mandatory, but it's very highly recommended. So what's the next one we should go to here?
Alrighty, well, the next one is a building inspector.
Yeah.
Now, we did a whole big episode on building inspection, so go listen to that. But a building inspector, for me, is mandatory. Like I always tell my clients, like I would get one in all cases, but it is technically optional. And I was speaking to a real estate agent recently, and he told me that only around 20% of the buyers he sells properties to, considering buying his properties, get building inspections.
It's crazy.
I was boggled my mind with that number. I would have thought if I'd guessed at least 50% of people do.
Yeah.
But the reason why sometimes people don't is because they're like, oh, it's such a big cost if I don't get that property. And it is. It is an annoying cost of buying property, but it is such a necessary cost, because we're talking about, potentially saving tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, by avoiding problems down the track. And there's so many benefits of getting a building inspection aside from just knowing whether you want to buy that property or not. It's factoring in your negotiation cost. It's factoring in your maintenance plan in the long term. And for me, I get a building inspection, and sometimes agents just don't understand why I do this, but even for brand new properties, because I just still want to see if there's any defects there. And sometimes for brand new properties, we will negotiate those defects to get fixed prior to settlement.
Absolutely. Sometimes newer properties have got some of the biggest issues, which you obviously alluded to there. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did an interview with a big platform basically that does building inspections, and you can sort of cost share it and things like that. And when I interviewed him, this on the elephant, I was surprised by how many the stats he was saying, exactly what you're saying, Amy, because absolutely what you're buying is an asset that if something is not right with that building, it could be a huge amount of sunk costs that you're never going to see that money again. And you could have just dodged a bullet by spending $400 or $500 on a building and pest inspector. And I think the really experienced ones, they do have it, like you said, while they document it and they give you they also will talk to you on the phone, and they will give you their, experience of how bad things really are, and, if they wouldn't buy the property because of these issues. And I just think you get a real good gauge by chatting to them if they're really concerned about something, because the report might be like, oh yeah, that wall's leaning over, but on the phone they'll be like, that wall could fall over at any point. That could be $200,000.
Or they could say it's actually not that bad. I just had to put it in the report because it technically had to put it in there. Context. Yeah. We want to get context with building inspections.
Yeah. And the reasons why they couldn't get into, I couldn't go upstairs or couldn't get in the roof because of that. And, generally couldn't get into it. And it concerns me, to be honest. Or actually, no, I don't think it's a big concern because of X, Y, Z. And that might not be in the report. So definitely try to chat to them. I do think you get a lot of confidence and around proceeding after you've got that report.
And depending on whether it's a private sale, depending on if you've got competition, etc., you can then make a decision whether you do get one up front, which there's lots of benefits of doing that, but then also the drawback is the cost if you don't get it. Or in some situations, you make your offer subject to a building inspection as well. So go back to that episode on building and pest inspections, because I deep dive into that much, much more thoroughly. And even apartments as well. Like a lot of people just don't get inspections on apartments, but the key costs there are things that you can't see. And the most often thing I have with apartments is showers leaking or moisture behind walls. And these are things that if the inspector doesn't identify, you're not going to know about it until it's too late, until the damage is quite serious. So besides, so with a building inspector as well, like you might also get a pest inspection too, and that's really going to depend on the property that you're buying. So we don't get pest inspections if it's like an apartment, for example, especially these brick apartments, or just get the building inspection, which is a lot cheaper then. So instead of say $600 or $700, it might be $300 or $400. But a pest inspection, a lot of building inspectors are also then qualified to do pest inspections too. But from doing that inspection, your inspector might identify extra things or issues or concerns which involve you engaging more professionals. This doesn't happen super often for us, but just some examples include sometimes we'll get a structural engineer out to provide further commentary. And I've had a few situations where they've come out and they've said, this building inspector was being a bit of a nana. There's no problems here, but better for us to just make sure. And then other times they've gone out and said, yep, this is a deal breaker, or this is going to be incredibly difficult to fix. And I know that the idea of a structural inspection, that sounds expensive, doesn't it? But in my experience, they're about the same price, if not a little bit more than a building inspection. We've also had plumbers go out plenty of times. I've got this one plumber on call. I speak to him like at least once a week to get him to go out and look at things or provide some quotes. He does charge to quote for people who, like for my clients who haven't bought a property yet, because he's not guaranteed to get that work. That's totally fair. And I think if you're engaging someone to do a quote as well and they're going to charge you and you haven't yet bought that property, just pay it. Like that is so worthwhile. And then sometimes I've had electrical inspections as well. And then also I've got on call a damp expert. I don't have to get him involved very much, but sometimes if the inspector has identified dampness and the client's really keen on that property, we get him out, get his opinion, again, to figure out, is that a deal breaker or is it something that can be fixed? Like, how do we fix that going forward?
Yeah, and I think part of your negotiation, particularly if you've done this up front and you're trying to deal with this pre-auction and trying to make an offer, sometimes the vendor's expectations are very high, or maybe they've got their own building and pest and, it was a favourable one because the agent organised it and it doesn't, highlight a few key issues. And you're able to, sometimes the vendor just doesn't know there's issues that, because they haven't had the building checked. And, when you're making your offer, you can highlight those issues and, and then it gives you a place to negotiate rather than, vendors' expectations are always inflated. We always think what we own is worth more than it is. And so it just gives you sometimes that bargaining tool. And absolutely, you're worth spending that extra money just to do that final check rather than your head in the sand. I'm in love with this property. Okay, there could be some issues down the line, but it's fine. And I'll try to kick that can down the road. I'll try to then resell it on with that issue in the future. Well, what happens if that issue becomes really, widely known, or someone else does that check and they're not willing to go to auction and bid on your property in the future? Then you can have less competition. You can have issues selling it, and you might be forced to fix it, even if it's not a huge issue that has to be fixed. No buyer wants to buy it until you fix it. So be really careful buying a bit of a property with problems if you haven't factored that into your purchase price.
Yeah. So when should you get the building inspector involved? It's kind of the same as my answer to the legal rep. You can get one last minute, and quite often you could get a building inspector within 24 hours out there if you absolutely needed to, same day. But ideally, you've got someone who you're going to use, or maybe a couple of people just in case they're not available, and you know their costs and you've got their details. So if you are in a situation where you need someone really quickly, again, you're not scrambling and panicking to try and find someone last minute. So at least having them in the back of your mind. But then, yeah, if you need to, I've had building inspectors out to a property within an hour if I need to, but I think I've got a bit more pull with my building inspectors because I use them hundreds of times a year.
Yeah, when Amy calls, we answer.
That's right. So, all right. So we've talked about, and again, building inspections optional but highly recommended. So we've talked about mortgage broker, we've talked about the legal representative and the building inspector, and those are kind of like the key ones that I think like come to a lot of people's minds when they're thinking about buying a property. But then there's a bunch of other ones which are very much optional, but we'll run through them just in case. So a buyer's agent, for example. So that is someone who helps you buy properties. And it's like the intermediary between you and the real estate agent. And they help with strategy, they help sourcing properties, finding off markets, due diligence, appraisals, auction bidding, everything. And it's becoming, and by the way, if you hadn't realized already, I'm a buyer's agent. This is what I do for work. And it is becoming more and more popular over time as people sort of see the value in doing it. But it is a cost, and it's a cost which can impact your borrowing capacity. And it's a cost which you need to see the value in, of course. So I see the value in buyer's agents for more reason than them just potentially saving you some money. There's value in your time and sanity and saving your relationships and just getting you a better outcome maybe sooner than you would yourself. But again, this is very much an optional extra professional that you can engage. You might try and do it yourself for a little while, see how you go, and then engage someone later on if you need that extra help. Or sometimes I've got clients that say from the very beginning, I've got no idea what I'm doing. I need you on board.
Yeah, I would say just the caveat to the buyer's agents. So I've been working with buyer's agents all the way back to 2012. I think that's when we might even have met all the way back there, Amy, back a long time ago. And I've worked with probably over 100. In fairness, or probably
over
not 100. Probably not far off it. I reckon.
I don't even know 100 buyers agents, Chris.
Probably, I reckon we refer to 40 to 50. I reckon, like if you add them all up across the country. But I would say that maybe 100 is a stretch, but I reckon at least 50 to 70 or something like that I've actually worked with in some form. I do think the quality of the buyer's agents varies dramatically. And there's a huge cohort of buyer's agents coming into the industry with very little experience and, on commission-only models and very salesy about just trying to get the transaction done and, particularly investor buyer's agents and things like that. So just be really careful who you engage, really have a good look at the history, where they've been buying, how long they've been buying for, who's training them, who's mentoring them, what areas, what agents actually know about them. So call some agents up and check to actually know who this person is.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Do your due diligence. It's a big cost, but B, it's once you make that big investment from a cost point of view, then you've got this sunk cost bias, right? And so you end up just going on with the process because you've already invested in it, and then you end up buying a property. So not only have you lost the cost because you didn't get a great service, but then you've gone and bought the wrong property rather than. So if you do your due diligence up front, pick the right buyer's agent, then that whole experience is a really nice experience and you get a good property because you picked the right buyer's agent. So it's one of those things. I think with a building inspector, maybe you don't spend weeks trying to figure out who's the best building inspector, right? But I do think spending weeks debating who's the best buyer's agent is worthwhile. Do your time up front. And then you get the right buyer's agent and you'll get a great result. If you don't, unfortunately, we've seen it go wrong too many times, not just by the bad experience, but the wrong property at the end of it. And it's really painful to unwind. It can be years and years of regret.
So then kind of along the lines like a buyer's advocate would be a financial planner, but not. In that, where I'm coming from there is in that it's very much optional. Very much optional. And it really comes down to the type of support and help you need and the value that you see in doing that. I think if you're buying a home, it's pretty, it's very optional. You don't necessarily need that extra strategic support from a financial planner around that. But, they're going to add value in different ways, like helping you map out the future and how that looks and how does that home fit into that. And how does that purchase then impact your longer term plans, and make sure you've got your insurances sorted to protect yourself when you've got a mortgage. So, I think that for me, anyone can benefit from a financial planner. But if your situation is pretty straightforward and vanilla and not too complex, and you don't necessarily need long-term support, then no need to get one. But I personally think that all investors should speak to a financial planner, at least chat to them at the very beginning. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to go through with it, but just to understand how they can add to you, because this is such a big decision that you're making, and to figure out how to build a portfolio over time, or make sure that purchase, the cash flows and the budget and the yield and everything like align with your long-term strategy. That's quite hard for a lot of investors to figure out themselves. So I would say in my, categorization, I would say strongly recommended for an investor, and then a home buyer, like quite optional.
Yeah, and I just think you've got to be careful a little bit. I don't know, sound like a broken record here. With planning, you've just got to really understand that the person you speak to is pro-property. They're not just anti-property.
Very much.
So they are looking at it as a viable option. They do understand what a good property is, which I don't know many do. But they also can compare that to different strategies. So they don't be like, no, property market's going to collapse. It's way overpriced. They're a big property bear. And, hey, you should just put your money in shares. It's much safer, blah, blah, blah. They should be able to provide a scenario analysis. Hey, if you put more money into super, this is how that benefits you. This is how it would benefit if you buy a little share portfolio. This is how you could buy a property, and, help you think through your different scenarios. And then you might say, well, actually, you know what? I could just pay my mortgage off, or I could just put some more money into super. I don't have to just go down this property, because sometimes we do that. And then sometimes you might also be missing easy wins. Just topping up your super a couple $100 a month might be affordable for you, and you might be missing that little benefit. But insurance is a big one. As soon as you take on that debt, particularly for first home buyers or investors, you've got to start thinking through, what happens if I couldn't work anymore because I got an injury or an illness, or what happens if I passed away or got disabled, or my wife or partner, or, so you've got to definitely get those insurances, and then your estate planning done after that. So
yeah, and if your financial planner, that's the person you're speaking to, if they start to give you specific advice around locations or the property itself, or like, you should buy in this particular block of apartments or this estate or something, just say, thanks for your time. You're not my planner anymore. Like, they should not be giving you that type of advice. That is the job of a buyer's agent. So just make sure all of these property professionals, I feel like I've said this on other episodes as well before, but because I'm in the center, I'll call myself the center of the universe when it comes to like organizing all of these professionals for my clients. And I have had people in the past step outside their lane. I've had building inspectors give their advice on the value of the property. I've had solicitors once comment on the location. Like, that is not their job. You need to be really careful if that happens, and just understand what everyone's role actually is.
I think you're right, because planners step into the property space with their mindset around investing, and they get sold. They fall for it in investment circles. They fall for the marketing, and they fall for the marketing in property, and they fall for the beliefs of depreciation and new property. And so they get a little bit to be dangerous, and they go out spruiking basically ignorantly, because they actually don't understand the dangers of it. And so be really careful if a planner's taking you down that route. I mean, it's probably a good time to flip into accountants. I mean,
I was going to say, speaking of depreciation, Chris, we can talk about accountants. And again, very much optional. And also, again, for a home buyer, you might not need an accountant, especially if your situation is quite simple and straightforward. But if you're buying an investment property, I do think that an accountant is really great, just to make sure that even to begin with, you're purchasing in the right structure, the right entity. You've got options here. You can buy in a trust, you can buy in a company, you can buy in personal name, etc. And it's hard, if not sometimes impossible, to change that later on without repercussions.
Yeah.
But then also, my accountant, bless him, he's super patient. He fields questions for me quite often about capital gains tax and things I can claim and can't claim. And, we've got a family trust and numerous companies for our developments, etc. And, these are not questions that are easily answerable yourself. So I think as an investor, an accountant is strongly, strongly recommended.
Absolutely. Particularly when you start doing things like Airbnb and, like you say, developments and renos and, I think the ATO is getting smarter and smarter. AI and the ATO are becoming friends, and you want to be on the right side of that. I think the old school way, the accountant that could skirt around and claim more and more things than you potentially should, I think you're asking for problems. And so just be really getting a great accountant, the one that gives you really good advice, not the one that will give you the biggest deductions.
And accountants,
so just be careful with that.
Accountants love depreciation because their job is to save you tax, right? And depreciation, it is technically saving you cash, like it's getting money back into your pocket. But if we look at it from the bigger picture, depreciation is a recognition of loss, an on-paper loss for a property. And the amount of accountants in the past who I've had tell their clients to buy properties which are brand new or really new so they can maximize depreciation, that is terrible, 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 terrible advice. So please, again, if your accountant is telling that to you, their job is to not recommend a property to get depreciation. Their job is to just explain to you what depreciation is.
Absolutely, and make sure they finish this, close the loop. I mean, a lot of people in the new property space say depreciation is deductible from an income tax point of view, but they don't explain what happens when you sell the property and how it affects capital gains tax. And I think that's a huge, what's that? Saying a little bit of the story, not disclosing the full picture. Because years later, when you go sell that property, you're like, oh my God, I got all these initial tax deductions, but now I've got a much higher capital gains tax bill because I reduced my cost base. So, accountants giving property advice, danger, 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 just as bad as the financial planners, if I'm honest. But getting a depreciation report isn't through the accountant. So even if you buy an established property, getting, a quantity surveyor doing a report for you, which might cost $500-$600, that will still give you some deductions on older buildings. And so it's not new buildings, even older buildings have depreciation. So you just need to engage them if you're buying an investment property to do a depreciation report.
Yeah, so that's another professional who, if you're an investor, you should always get one. And if your property is super, super old and you're not sure, just have a chat to one and they'll tell you whether it's worthwhile or not, the cost of their report versus the amount that you might be able to claim back over the lifetime that you own that property. And I think, a lot of investors forget to do this. They'll buy an investment property, maybe they just won't even know about it, or it'll be on their list of things to do and they just forget about it. So ideally, once you buy an investment property, just get onto it straight away. You've got that report. That report will, have the depreciation over the next, I think, is it 20 years, 30 years? I think it's 30 years. And then every year I just give that to my accountant, just that they've got that on file. So there's plenty of quantity surveyors out there. Again, optional, but strongly recommended.
Absolutely. So who have we missed, Amy? We've got, if you're renovating, that's probably, and a lot of people are renovating, right? Even if you're wanting to do small tweaks or knock down rebuilds, if you are going to do one of those, I recommend, if you've got time, is to try to get as much DD done prior to purchasing it, because with renovations, things like flame zones or what's possible on that land with town planning and easements and, the state of the property is in and how much work it would be with an architect, the floor plan. You can pay, a few $1,000s to do all this DD up front, which may say, I thought it'd be $500,000 to renovate this place, but that's, pie in the sky. It's really going to cost well over $1 million.
We're probably going to have to do a whole separate episode on this, because the amount of professionals that you can get involved in the renovation extension process there's so many of them, and you might need a couple of them, you might not need any of them or all of them. And I'm mindful of the time, but just as an example, the types of professionals who you might engage, not necessarily beforehand, because sometimes, for example, a builder is not going to be able to quote a full extension if you don't have plans. You're not going to always be able to get plans done before you buy a property. And Absolutely. In which case, the way that I overcome that issue is I'll speak to, builders, or I'll speak to, say, kitchen renovation places and just say, have you done any projects of a similar scale recently, and how much have they costed? That's sometimes the best that you can do.
Absolutely.
But I'm renovating my house at the moment. It's a full extension, and the professionals I used was a draftsperson. So I used a draftsperson, or you might use an architect. And it's I'll use the comparison to a solicitor versus conveyancer, whereas an architect's more qualified and experienced, but you don't necessarily always need one, and they are more expensive. You might need a town planner if you need any kind of planning approvals or planning permissions, a soil tester, an arborist potentially, to be able to do a tree report for you, just depending on what you need, a building surveyor. So there's all of these extra people, and it's, again, we'll save this for another episode one day, because sometimes you can project manage, like I did, engage all of these people separately, or sometimes you can just pay someone, say, I don't know what I'm doing, and it'll cost you a bit more, but they will organise all of this for you, because it can be quite overwhelming.
Absolutely. So as we close out 2023, you're probably listening in 2024 if you're buying. Hopefully this has been helpful in helping you figure out who to engage. And if you'd like any help from Amy in Melbourne, or you're looking to talk to a broker, absolutely check in the show notes for our contact details. And I wish everyone a great 2024, you included, Amy.
Yeah, you too, Chris. Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much.
See you later.